I am very glad to be with you this morning to share post-colonial study of Christianity and its implications for Christian mission. I want to thank those of you who have gotten up very early this morning to join us, as well as those missionaries around the world joining this first session of this exciting course. First of all, I want to talk about why I am interested in post-colonial study of Christianity. I was born in Hong Kong, a former British colony. When I grew up, I was a British subject. And throughout my grade school, we had Chinese teachers, but we communicated with each other at high school in English. And so I've been thinking about the identity of being a formerly colonized person for a very long time. Many of you recall that in 1997, Hong Kong was returned by Britain to China. At that time, my colleagues in Hong Kong were thinking about how to prepare the church and the Hong Kong society for the post-colonial era. Although at that time I was teaching in the United States, this momentous change certainly had very great influence in my own personal and professional life. So I've been thinking about post-colonial study of Christianity in the 90s. This morning, I'm glad to share with you post-colonial theory has been introduced to biblical studies, theology, and the practical fields. I wonder how many of you have heard about anything regarding post-colonial theory or post-colonial Christianity. If you have heard about it, can you raise your hand so that I can see, oh, many of you have already heard about it. So I am glad that this will be a refresher for those of you who already know something. And for those of you, this is new to you, please look at it as a general layout of the map. And then throughout the lecture, I will point to key texts in post-colonial study of the Bible and theology, and then you can follow up later. And this lecture is being recorded. So if you want to look at the PowerPoint and also refresh your memory of what I will be speaking, please do so as well. I certainly welcome your comments, your questions at the end. So please remember to put them in the chat box so our colleagues can call upon you after the break for conversation. Because so many of you are in different parts of the world, in Taiwan, in Malawi, and in Laos, and other parts of the world, you also encountered a post-colonial situation that is very existential. So I hope you will also join to share your insights as well as your comments at the end of the presentation. I want to start by sharing a YouTube video of hymn singing at a Methodist church in Hong Kong. This is a very familiar hymn, and I certainly know that some of you may know it, and you're welcome to sing in your own language. asked the question, why would a church in Hong Kong, a Methodist church, singing this hymn written by an American, Iraq Stanfield, in 1950? I know that many of you have sung this song in different languages, in different parts of the world. Why is that so? Would you say that this is an example of the church being universal? Or you will say, this signifies again the dominance of Western Christianity. In this particular case, American music and American Christianity. How would hymn singing or worship style affect our spiritual life and inscribe us to become certain persons? Is it very true that some of those Chinese attacked the Chinese church, saying, if you have one more Christian, you have one less Chinese? I think those are very important questions if we are going to consider post-colonial Christianity. To unpack that, I would like to begin by talking about the modern colonial world system. I want to introduce the work of the scholar Immanuel Wallenstein. He introduced this world systems analysis. Here, you can see the world in circles or ovals. This is the formation of different trade regional systems. And you can see, if you look at this map, it explains why it was Portugal and Spain that wanted to explore different sea routes to go to Asia or to travel to other parts of the world. Because Portugal and Spain were located at the margin of Europe, whereas the other regional trade systems have been formed and they did not dominate. So they wanted to explore to expand their influence. And once that regional system between Europe and North America was formed, it displaced the regional system of Mediterranean to become a dominant part of the world. And he said this world system was then located in only a part of the globe, primarily in parts of Europe and the Americas. It expanded over time to cover the whole globe. And we remember the formation of modernity was closely linked to the colonial system that was formed. To bring this closer at home, this particular map shows the colonies in the Americas around 1763. You can see different European powers exerted influences in different parts of the Americas. In 1776, after the American Revolutionary War, there was the Declaration of Independence, and United States formed a new nation, no more a colony of Britain. What about Latin America? Now, this map is important because today we talk about the Global South, but the colonial history was quite different in Latin America from that of Africa and Asia. Here you can see some of the countries regained independence early on, as far back as the 19th century. You can see Brazil around 1822 to 29. This is the world in the 1920s, about 100 years ago. Those of us who can recognize the flags of the European nations can then recognize all these colonies around the world that were controlled by different European powers. In 1850, Western powers held approximately 35% of the Earth's surface. But by 1914, Europe controlled a total of roughly 85% of the Earth. So if today we are talking about the post-colonial world, that means the majority of the world's people have experienced being colonized in one way or the other. And then on the other side, you have the colonizing powers or empires. Let's look at the British Empire. The United Kingdom, of course, was a very small area, but you can see the vastness of the British Empire during the heyday of colonialism. The next slide shows why we'll be talking about post-colonial today. Because after the Second World War, African and Asian countries regained their independence. Together with political independence, the people in these nations were also struggling for cultural autonomy and sometimes religious autonomy as well. So today, when we are talking about the post-colonial, we are mainly referring to the world after political struggles and independence, after the Second World War, and how it has changed the world as we have come to know, and how it affects our understanding of Christianity, and also the ways that we are doing Christian mission. So let me then talk about what is post-colonial. For those of you who are new to the subject, obviously, post is a very interesting prefix. It can mean after in a temporal sense. Before 1997, Hong Kong was a British colony. After 1997, Hong Kong returned to China. So it entered a post-colonial stage. This is the temporal sense. But post, the prefix can also mean reading strategies and discursive practices of resistance. In this sense, it is not necessarily temporal. So you have to hold these two senses of the word post-colonial in your mind when you proceed to explain post-colonial Christianity. I have followed Ian Lumber's definition. Post-colonial imagination is a process of disengagement from the whole colonial syndrome. By the whole colonial syndrome, it can mean socio-political struggle. It can mean the cultural legacy of colonialism. It might even mean the impact of Christian mission, if Christian mission has colluded with empire and colonialism. So when did post-colonial theory or studies begin? Certainly, the scholars debated, but we can trace the theory to earlier days, to the anti-colonial struggles. Some of us are familiar with these three gentlemen, Frantz Fanon, writing from the Algerian Revolution of the time, and Aimé Césaire from Munich, and many of us have read Chinua Achebe from Nigeria's novel, Things Fall Apart. So although they did not call themselves post-colonial, they might be advocating the negritude movement or revolutionary struggles. We certainly want to say their work has paved the way for the later development of post-colonial studies. Because I have emphasized we did not come to the post-colonial situation in the same time frame or in the same way. That is why today when we are talking about post-colonial Laos is very different from post-colonial Malawi. That is why here I posted several texts to talk about different post-colonial. From the far left, you have Local Histories, Global Design. And this book talks about colonial, post-colonial in the Americas, especially from the Latin American perspective. You have Frantz Fanon's famous book, Red Skin, White Masks. And then in the middle, you have the founding text of what today we call post-colonial theory or studies. Edward Said, a Palestinian American's book, published in 1978, Orientalism. And then from India, we have Gayatri Spivak's book, Beyond Post-Colonial Studies, a critique of post-colonialism, and from the South India Asian situation. And then we have someone from Cameroon on the post-colony. And so this is one of the very important texts talking about African revolution and the long road to freedom. And since then, he has also published other books, Professor Membi. So as I have explained, you might come from different vantage points when we look at the post-colonial situation. And therefore, you may also look at post-colonial Christianity from different angles. So what are the challenges of post-colonial studies to Christianity? First, we need to ask what has been the church's roles in colonialism. Did the church support empire and colonization? Were there differences in different denominations? Now, the Roman Catholic Church is a particular case. Why? Because it was also under the name of evangelization of the natives that the emperors in Spain and Portugal allowed the missionaries and colonial officials to go to the Americas. It served as the first globalizing force. And certainly at that time, the Mass was conducted in Latin. So you have the Latinization of the world as well. We also need to ask, do we use a Eurocentric lens to study Christianity? Did we learn anything about Taiwanese Christianity in our graduate training in divinity schools? Did we learn anything about African Christianity? Or do we just focus on Europe or in United States? I have asked you to prepare for today's session an article that talks about from Christian mission to world Christianity. What is the difference of mission and world Christianity? I will also speak a little bit more about that towards the end. But for me, as someone who has grown up throughout my formative period in a colonial system, I think the last one is the most difficult. How to challenge the colonial mindset in Christianity to provide shared values for global citizenship. I have gone through a very lengthy colonial education. And how can I then challenge or get rid of some of this colonial epistemology or mindset in order to look at Christianity anew? So since the mid-90s, I have devoted my professional career to answer this question. How can we challenge our colonial mentality in Christianity? So today, I will be talking about the postcolonial study of Christianity. This will be divided into 3 parts. The first part will be talking about the Bible. The second part, about theology. The last part, I will talk about practical theology before I bring in Christian mission by talking about Professor Clark's article. So what is postcolonial study of the Bible? Here, we really have the dean of the study of postcolonial studies of the Bible, Dr. R.S. Sugi Faraja, who has retired from University of Birmingham. He has written many books on postcolonial studies of the Bible. So he defined postcolonial studies of the Bible like this. He said, what it does is to focus on the whole issue of expansion, domination, and imperialism as central forces in defining both biblical narratives and biblical interpretation. I want to draw your attention to 2 things that he says. 1, in biblical narratives, that is the text itself. 2nd, in the history or trajectory of biblical interpretation. So it is not just talking about did we interpret it correctly, that is talking about the interpretation. But it is also talking about what was written in the text. How did the Hebrew people or early Christians thought at that time about empire, about colonialism? So I want to introduce some of the texts that you might want to consult. And you have the postcolonial perspectives in African biblical interpretations, a very huge book, 2-inch thick. You have the postcolonial Bible reader. You have the commentaries on the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible from a postcolonial perspective. One of the earliest book written in this American context on postcolonial studies is by Fernando Segovia, Decolonizing Biblical Studies, coming from a Cuban American perspective. And if you want to hear more about the feminist side of it, this is the classical text by Musa Dubi from Botswana, Postcolonial Feminist Interpretation of the Bible. I want to share with you, Professor Dubi will soon join me as a colleague in the fall of 2021 to teach New Testament at Canberra School of Theology. Now moving on, what are some of the postcolonial concerns? We pay attention to what kind of themes when we want to look at the Bible from postcolonial point of view. Well, the Bible lends itself to postcolonial studies because it deals with the theme of travel, space and spatial construction, boundaries, borderland, border crossing, indigenous populations, racial and ethnic formation, diaspora, uprooting, displacement, class, war, violence, displacement, gender, international relations, and even globalization. So you can see there might be people who think, oh, we cannot just look at an ancient text, that is the Bible, through these new jargons or new theories. Well, I say, wait a minute. Our concerns are all these things. Do you not find boundaries? Do you not find international relations? For example, between the Israelites and the Assyrians in the Bible? Can we learn something from that situation to illuminate our own context today? So as you can see, we are not superimposing the lens of postcolonial criticism. We are using insights from the postcolonial theories to look at these themes that are already in the Bible. But these themes may not be the focus of the studies. Today, when we look at the Bible anew for insights for our global politics or international relations, we certainly want to see what the Bible can tell us. And of course, postcolonial studies is so important to understand the Bible, because the Hebrew Bible and early Christians lived under the shadows of Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires. So let me introduce the work of Musa Dubi and give us a few examples of how we can use her insights to look at particular biblical stories to illustrate what I mean. She asked 4 questions to any text. 1, does the text challenge imperialism? Does the text encourage travel to distant land? How? What does the text construct? Difference. And does this text use gender to construct relations of domination and submission? Now, this is where feminist interpretation comes in. Let us use these 4 questions to look at the first story. That is the Exodus. This obviously is a famous story. The Hebrew people, they were oppressed by pharaohs when they were in Egypt. And so by the leadership of Moses and Joshua, they were led into the land of Canaan. This becomes very controversial for Native Americans because they look at Exodus not as a story of liberation or blessing. They identify themselves with the Canaanites. Before Europeans came to the Americas, the indigenous people already lived in Americas for a long time, just like the Canaanites were there for a long time. Now, using the 4 questions, did the story of the Exodus support imperialism? At that time, we may not call imperialism. Why? Because the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew people, they did not have a lot of power yet. But it talked about conquest. Make no mistake, the people in Canaan, they really experienced that as horrifying experience. Did the Exodus talk about travel to the distant land? It did, and patronizing that as well. How did the Bible talk about the Canaanites? That is the construction of difference. Were they seen as negative, problematic, worshipping idols? And how was gender defined? What did the leaders or the prophets of that time talk about the Canaanites, talk about intermarriage, or talk about their women? So now, using the same questions, we can look at another story. Here, we talk about the captivity of Israel and Judah. You have the purple arrows. That is the time when the northern kingdom, Israel, was defeated. And then the people were forced to go to the other parts that the Assyrians brought them to. And then you have the green arrows. Here, you have the Babylonian captivity because Judah, the southern kingdom, was defeated and the people were exiled to so many foreign lands. So go back to the 4 questions. How did the Hebrew people remember exile, diaspora? Was that story used to subvert and challenge empires, the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire? How did the Bible talk about traveling to a distant land? Sometimes it was not voluntary. It might be very involuntary, that is, forced into exile. How did the prophets talk about that? Did the writers of the Hebrew Bible talk about forced exile? And then, how did the Bible construct difference between different people? And how gender relationships were described? As you can see, if we read the Bible in this way, the Bible certainly becomes alive today. Because in our current context, we have the dispersal of people for various reasons. Migration is a very important issue. In your October class, my colleague, Professor Jiho Hensels, will further talk about migration. But here, in the biblical world or biblical narrative, we certainly have stories about exile, dispersal, displacement, and the big powers oppressing the small nations. Sounds familiar? So this is what the postcolonial interpretation of the Bible will help us to unpack those narratives and search for insights for today. Now, I want to talk about the second part, the intersection between postcolonial and theology. Now, on the surface, the intersection between the postcolonial and the theological appears to be tenuous. After all, most postcolonial theorists harbor negative attitudes towards religion in general, and Christianity in particular. But if Christianity has played such an important enabling role in colonialism and empire building, the study of the postcolonial will not be complete without engaging the theological. The theological also needs the critique and contribution of the postcolonial because the theological enterprise is laden with imperial assumptions and motives, ever since Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. Theologian Catherine Keller said, when Christianity opened its young mouth to speak, it spoke in the many tongues of the empire, nations and languages colonized by Rome, and before that, Greece, and before that, Babylon, which had first dispersed the Jews into imperial space. Let us take a moment to ponder the significance of crucifixion. Now, crucifixion was a state torture. Jesus died on the cross as a political prisoner. He was accused of being the king of the Jews. So we cannot see crucifixion as from just a religious point of view. Without looking, Jesus and his disciples, they were colonized by the Roman Empire. And Jesus died as a political prisoner. So these are several books I would like to introduce to you if you are interested in postcolonial theologies. Postcolonial theology is a training of our imagination, an attempt to construct a religious worldview that promotes justice, peaceful coexistence, radical plurality, and democratic practice. We have to look back to the past to gain insight to how different theologians in different periods have grappled with imperial power. I have co-edited this volume, Empire and the Christian Tradition. You have essays all the way from Paul to today's theologians. So I encourage you, if you are interested, to get hold of a copy. My co-editor, Yor Rieger, said, the connection between empire and Christianity were either taken for granted or simply overlooked. What was lost in the process was not only a clear understanding of how the forces of empire impact us all, consciously or unconsciously, but also a sense of how Christianity can never quite be absorbed by empire altogether, and which of its resources push beyond empire. So it's very ambivalent. Sometimes the theologians contested empire. Sometimes, unfortunately, they colluded with empire. I have published this monograph, Postcolonial Imagination and Feminist Theology, in 2005. And in this book, I use both a postcolonial and feminist lens to look at theology. In the book, I talked about the relationship between gender and imperialism. I talk about how can we talk about women's experience, because many white women in the United States would take middle-class white women to be the norm. And then we have to talk about gender of God and the Savior. I also wanted in this book to raise the voices of women from Global South. I also talk about the relationship between women and nature. Here, I will just briefly talk about this concept that is very important in postcolonial theology, hybridity. Hybridity is a very important concept proposed by theorist Homi Bhabha. Hybridity contests purity, fixed or binary categories, and the imposition of the same. Hybridity is the result of the collision or coalescence of two cultures, or sometimes multiple cultures, when one is perceived as dominating the other within a colonial context. This hybrid space is a space of resistance, rewriting, and reappropriating. I try to find an idea in Christianity to talk about hybridity. I find this. That is, in Christian art, we find a compelling image of a third space or hyperspace. In the artworks about Annunciation, that is the open and inviting space created between the hands of the angel and Mary. This contact space between the divine and human can be both inviting and potentially threatening. And in this in-between space, one experiences, as Mary did, disorientation, re-examination, and to try on new roles and perhaps gains new consciousness. Here, I want to move on, because of time, to the third part, postcolonial study of the practical fields. Stephen Burns and Michael Jesser published this book, Christian Worship, Postcolonial Perspectives. This is a very important book because they raise the questions such as the use of symbolisms and liturgical language, and even music. For example, in many liturgies, you will have the images of light and darkness. Light is always portrayed as good. Dark would be not so good. So this might reinforce racism around the world. For practical theologians, they have to investigate the intersection between culture, the church, and academy. I just want to briefly lift up 3 examples by my colleague at Kendall School of Theology, Emmanuel Latte, whose Colonializing God, in which he presented a practical theology, especially for counseling from African perspective. In the middle, you have the book by Sarah Travis, Decolonizing Preaching. At the right-hand side, you'll have Hey An Kim Craig, a Canadian theologian from a Korean background, and the title of the book is Interdependence. This is the first book on a postcolonial feminist critical theology. Now I want to move on to Professor Clark's article, in which he talks about world Christianity and postcolonial mission. In this slide, you can see the shifting demographics. In 2025, Africa, with 634 million Christians, will be the country becoming one of the most important place for Christianity, and therefore should be one of the foci in the study of Christian history and evangelism. And you can see Europe now became the third on this list. It is important by 2050, only about 1/5 of the world's 3 billion Christians will be non-Hispanic white. So some of the missiologists, like Laman Sanet, had said that Christianity has become a non-Western religion. In Professor Clark's article, he talks about postcolonial mission. He offers 4 points. 1, mission is no more from the global north to the global south. Rather, it is from the global south and the east. I know that Korean churches have been sending missionaries throughout the world. Professor Clark also mentioned the critique of Christian missions' collusion with colonialism. And we must have this preferential option for the marginalized when we carry out God's mission. And we need to continue to probe and challenge neo-colonial forces, like the neoliberal economy. So I want to conclude by sharing with you what I mean by postcolonial mission and how this is different from the earlier forms of mission. In an early era, mission may be more one-way traffic. Today, we want to talk about two-way partnership. There is both give and take in mission. Before, usually mission was carried out from global north to the south. Today, I'm glad to hear the United Methodist Church have been talking about from everywhere to everywhere, missions from all directions. Before, we might have pretty much a definitive understanding of the gospel. We want to prescribe it across the world. And today, we must talk about the gospel being incarnated. It needs to use the myths, language, legends, and way of life in the particular missional context. The gospel needed to incarnate. Before that, if we are Methodist missionary, we went to other parts of the world, set up a Methodist church, use the same hymnal and worship book. Today, we must be talking about multicultural, and we need to create hybrid spaces. So when we come back, I want to hear some of you how you have been trying to create this hybrid or in-between spaces in various parts of the world. Before, we emphasize mission is for the church, planting church, building church. Certainly today, we need to talk about this is God's mission. Sometimes it might involve church planting. Other times, it might be working with communities and local groups to advance God's kingdom in the world by various means. So I hope this morning I have given you some brief introduction to postcolonial study of Christianity and offer you some insights of what postcolonial mission may look like.